The willingness with which our young people are likely to serve in any war, no matter how justified, shall be directly proportional to how they perceive veterans of earlier wars were treated and appreciated by their nation. George Washington said that. And man, those words hit hard, don't they? It gets right to the heart of what we're diving into today. The often overlooked story of American POWs left behind in Southeast Asia. You see, those iconic images of Operation Homecoming kind of cemented this idea that all our POWs came home after Vietnam. But what if that wasn't the whole story? That's what we're going to look at today. We're about to unpack some really challenging questions, all based on Wesley Fryer's 1991 research paper, American POWs in Southeast Asia and the Violation of a National Ethic. Fryer's argument hinges on this idea of a PR ethic, a sort of unspoken promise woven into the fabric of America's history, and he claims that promise was broken.
Yeah, it's fascinating how Fryer doesn't point to a single document or declaration to define this POW ethic, right? He argues that it evolved over time. It became this implicit code of conduct.
Okay, so let's trace the evolution. Where does he start?
Well, he takes us all the way back to the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. Even amidst the brutality of those conflicts, you see glimpses of this belief that POWs deserved a certain level of humane treatment, simply because of their status.
Interesting. So even in those early days, the seeds of this ethic were being sown.
Exactly. And he even uses examples from the Mexican War to illustrate this. Some American soldiers who defected to fight for Mexico were treated with, well, more leniency than you might expect. And he argues that's an early example of this developing notion of a POW deserving humane treatment.
Wow, that's pretty surprising. You wouldn't expect that kind of consideration in the middle of a war.
Right. And then this concept really solidifies during World War II, especially in the Pacific Theater.
Yeah.
The horrific treatment of American POWs by the Japanese, think the Bataan Death March, the blatant disregard for the Geneva Conventions, it created this national resolve, like, we do not abandon our own.
So you can see how this historical backdrop sets the stage for how America approached the Vietnam War. And of course, there was a huge emphasis on rescuing downed pilots, even if those missions were incredibly dangerous.
And you know, those rescue missions, like the Sun Tay raid, they weren't just about saving lives. They were about sending a message. You know, they were a powerful symbol of America's commitment to bringing in soldiers home, no matter the cost. Yeah.
You're right. It was a powerful message for everyone listening, our soldiers, their families, and even the enemy. And that brings us to a really intriguing part of Fryer's argument. He suggests that this commitment to bringing soldiers home, this POW ethic, wasn't just an American ideal. He says it actually factored into the enemy's calculations as well.
Oh, absolutely. Fryer points out how North Vietnam used this POW ethic to their advantage, really. It was almost like an unspoken agreement. You fight us hard, but you'll get your soldiers back eventually.
Which makes sense when you think about it. If you're a North Vietnamese strategist, you know America will go to great lengths to bring their POWs home. So you factor that into your strategy.
Exactly. And this sets the stage for what Fryer calls a pivotal moment. The 1973 Paris Peace Accords. We all remember those incredible scenes of POWs returning home during Operation Homecoming.
It felt like a victory, like a promise kept.
But was it? That's the question Fryer wants us to consider. He argues that the return of those 591 POWs wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. And to make his case, he points to a piece of evidence you won't believe. A secret letter penned by President Nixon himself.
Okay, now this is getting good. A secret Nixon letter. You've got my attention. What did it say?
Well, this letter, it was sent to Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Van Dong. And in it, Nixon promised billions of dollars in post-war aid to Vietnam. And Fryer doesn't present this as just a gesture of goodwill, you know. He suggests this aid was a strategic move by Nixon, a way to ensure the release of at least some American prisoners.
So you're saying there might have been a quid pro quo, release some POWs in exchange for billions in aid.
Fryer lays out that very possibility, and he adds another layer by reminding us about Vietnam's deep distrust of the West. They had been burned before, with broken promises, dating back to the canceled elections of 1956.
Right. They had every reason to be skeptical of Western intentions. So even with this PO ethic in play, the situation was incredibly complex.
Exactly. You have to imagine the calculations being made on both sides.
Yeah.
And for Vietnam, it might have felt like a huge gamble to trust that America would honor its word, even with something as fundamental as the return of POWs.
Okay, so billions are promised, some POWs come home, but then the war ends in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. Did things become any clearer about the fate of the remaining POWs?
Well, that's where things take another unexpected turn. The Montgomery Report, released that same year, essentially declared that there was no evidence of any remaining American POWs. Case closed, right?
Except, we're not done yet, are we? Something tells me that report didn't tell the whole story.
You're right. Because just a few years later, in 1979, an American named Robert Garwood returns from Vietnam. He had been missing, presumed dead, since 1965.
Wait, so a missing Marine suddenly appears after everyone's been told there are no more POWs? Talk about a bombshell.
Right. It directly contradicted the Montgomery report. And Garwood didn't just come back quietly. He testified before Congress, claiming he'd seen dozens of other American prisoners while he was held captive in Vietnam, even after the war officially ended.
Wow, his testimony must have sent shockwaves through Washington.
Absolutely. It called everything into question. And then, as if things couldn't get any wilder, we have the 1986 Tide report.
And this report, it's still classified, right? What do we know about it?
Even the public details are pretty shocking. The report directly challenged the Montgomery report's findings, suggesting that there could be American POWs still alive in Southeast Asia.
So we have a returning POW, a classified report suggesting the possibility of more POWs. It's hard to imagine more compelling evidence that something was amiss.
And it's not over yet. General Tide, the former director of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, went on record saying he believed Americans were still being held against their will.
Okay, so now we have the former head of the DIA weighing in, someone with deep intelligence experience saying he believes there are still POWs in Southeast Asia. And if that wasn't enough, Fryer drops one final bombshell, Garnett Bell. He was the head of the U.S. office in Hanoi for POW/MIA affairs. He actually stated in 1991 that the United States did leave servicemen behind at the end of the war. I mean, this isn't some conspiracy theorist. This is a high-ranking government official saying it point blank. It makes you wonder, was this just a tragic oversight or something more deliberate?
That's exactly the line Fryer walks. He lays out this incredibly unsettling scenario. What if a decision was made?
To leave some POWs behind, to ensure the peace agreement held.
So they're sacrificing soldiers for a political win. A successful peace agreement would have been huge for Nixon. He was under immense pressure to get the U.S. out of Vietnam.
And that's where it gets really complicated, because America likes to see itself as a liberator, right? A defender of freedom. But if we left our own men behind, how do we reconcile that with our own self-image?
Yeah, Fryer doesn't shy away from that question. He argues that it cuts the core of who we are as a nation. And it's not just about the men left behind, right? It's about their families left with decades of unanswered questions, clinging to hope.
Fryer then posits something that seems unthinkable. Could our desire to normalize relations with Vietnam actually be hindering efforts to bring these POWs home?
It's a heartbreaking irony, if so. We want closure. We want to move on. But what if that means perpetuating the very injustice we're trying to address? If we just accept Vietnam's insistence that there are no more American POWs, haven't we just closed the book on the issue?
So where does that leave us? Fryer has presented a lot of evidence, a lot to unpack. What can our listeners do with this information?
Well, to me, Fryer's work is a call to action. Don't just accept the comfortable version of history. Read the sources. Ask the tough questions. Demand accountability. And remember the men who might still be out there waiting to come home.
That's a powerful message. And for our listeners, if Fryer's paper has piqued your interest, I really encourage you, seek it out, read it for yourselves, and ask, has America lived up to its own POW ethic? This deep dive has certainly given us a lot to think about. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions.